iteration of the SDGs series, the literature of sustainability. Today is SDG 3, good health and well-being. Thanks to our regulars. We have some power issues in the university buildings. So if we go dark, it's not metaphorical, it's very literal. And welcome to Dr. Lucy Burke, to whom I was just saying that the first essays I read on dementia narratives were her. So in many ways, she's responsible for all the work I have done. As you can see, I'm shifting blame onto you, Dr. Burke. I'll hand this over to Atul for the emceeing of the day. Please meet Atul, who's our project assistant, and my colleague and faculty fellow in the University Chair, Professor Anna Kurid, who's a Shakespeare Scholar Studies. Over to you, Atul.
Yes, thank you, sir. It's a great privilege to have Professor Lucy Burke with us today. And if I may formally introduce her to the audience, Lucy Burke works at the intersection of cultural and literary disability studies and the critical medical humanities. She has published widely on the representation of dementia and learning disability in literature and film, and she is a member of the Wellcome Institute Committee, the Medical Humanities arm, the steering group of the Northern Network of Medical Humanities Research, the editorial board of the Journal of Literary and Cultural Disability Studies, the advisory board of the Wellcome Trust Living Bodies Objects, and the Edinburgh University Press, contemporary cultural studies in illness, health, and medicine. She is currently completing two forthcoming monographs titled Why Should We Care? The Manifesto Press and Dementia Culture from the Liverpool University Press. Her lecture today is titled Cultures of Life and Death, Aging, Dementia, and Climate Change in the work of Barbara Kingslover and Ruth Ozeki. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you. It's a real honour. I've tried to orient my paper around the SDG goals, SDG 3 particularly, and to think think through the issues that are coming up in the novels that I discuss in that context. I'm really happy if anyone wants to read the paper afterwards to share it as well. Please feel free. I hope I don't echo. If I do, please let me know again, and we can try and do something about that. Okay, so in keywords, Raymond Williams describes his interest in clusters of words that present active problems of meaning. Language that demanded his attention, quote, because the problems of its meanings seemed to me inextricably bound up with the problems it was being used to discuss. Crucially, he reminds us that it is necessary to insist that the most active problems of meaning are always primarily embedded in actual relationships, and that both the meanings and the relationships are typically diverse and variable within the structures of particular social orders and the processes of social and historical change. Although nearly half a century old, Williams's work has not lost its relevance nor its usefulness in its endeavour, as Marie Moran puts it, to identify words whose evolving meanings seem somehow to capture, express and legitimise the politics and sensibility of their socio-historical context. The importance of exploring the meanings and ideological struggle encoded in language necessitates an understanding of the entanglement of these keywords, in particular institutional practices, political systems and their historical legacies, social and cultural discourse, and to borrow Louis Althusser's famous formulation, in the final analysis, economic determinants. I start here because this recognition that the meanings of words are far from straightforward, fixed or singular is helpful for any consideration of what we might mean when we talk about health and well-being for all ages, particularly what this might mean for people living with dementia. These are all heavily freighted concepts and ones whose apparently straightforward, commonsensical meanings belie far less stable and easily knowable attributions, especially when we take inequalities of wealth, uneven development, and cultural differences into account. Yet the positing of health and well-being as fundamental expressions of an ethical commitment to the good life in the Aristotelian sense, and as core objectives in sustainable development, is plainly important. How we understand both these ideas and the relationships between the two, whether one term health, for instance, is necessary to the other, well-being, and how both might be used to think about the interactions and reciprocities between individuals, communities, or environments, including the complex and shifting interactions of space, place, and the embodied self, is what I want to explore today in relation to selected works by the novelists Barbara Kingsolver and Ruth Ozeki, two writers who can be described as both politically committed and environmentally conscious, and whose work trace what Rob Nixon describes as the slow violence of environmental destruction through what I will cautiously describe as the high point and current death throes of the global and ideological economic project of late neoliberal capitalism. Kingsolver's Animal Dreams was published in 1990, the point at which Francis Fukuyama confidently declared the end of history and the triumph of liberal democracy, a position that has become increasingly untenable due to multiple global and economic crises, shocks and conflicts since the fall of the Soviet bloc. As I've argued elsewhere, conditions such as dementia, and increasingly now the attribution of disability itself when it's deployed to signify any need for additional support, function as highly charged political categories at the centre of a range of debates about economic sustainability and, more broadly, about the value of some lives over others. As many scholars have noted, we cannot easily disentangle contemporary ideologies of successful or active aging from utilitarian neoliberal epistemologies of human value, in which the physically active, socially engaged older person, I mean this is particularly in the global north, is juxtaposed with the bed-blocking, resource-consuming, joy-stealing older person with dementia. As Lynn Sandberg and Barbara Marshall note, quote, the concept of successful ageing has acted as a vortex of professional, political and commercial interests. In this ideological scenario, there is no good ageing with dementia and no good life with any significant impairment. Disability, frailty and dependency in old age are presented as intrinsically burdensome assaults upon lives, communities and economies, and as such as the obstacle to social and economic regeneration. The seductive powers of this are in evidence across a range of popular cultural texts and novels. For instance, in Lionel Shriver's The Mandibles, in which social and cultural regeneration following economic collapse is literally impeded by the care needs of an abject and monstered older generation, or in the Netflix TV series Orphan Black, in which the cloned bodies of the young are exploited to sustain the fantasies of immortality exercised by a typically malign and wealthy older scientist. And obviously this is a much longer legacy of representations too. So it's on this ideological terrain that we need to position the widespread emphasis upon individual responsibility for health, well-being and agency and ageing, and the economic apparatus that's developed around this. Certainly in the global north, personal responsibility for one's health has come to dominate, emerging in tandem with the private or outsourcing of health and social care in countries that have previously had a welfare state apparatus, and cuts to public health initiatives and institutions. It's inextricably tied to injunctions to invest time and money on fitness, prevention, optimization, and anti-aging activities and interventions. This has intensified in the rapid shift to digital surveillance capitalism, in which the value of health and well-being is tied to the logic of consumption and the generation of surplus value and profit via online activities. The empty, repetitive temporality of 24/7 digital culture is taken up and populated by injunctions to subscribe to mailing lists or YouTube channels, to purchase supplements or follow dietary plans, to like and to comment, to download apps and ebooks, entangling us in our isolated virtual worlds with what Will Davis describes as the, quote, infrastructures of measurement, surveillance and government, driven, as Amit Ghosh puts it, by the rhetorical power this age of enumeration accords to numbers, graphs and charts, and fostering the illusion that recording is somehow the same as qualitative, meaningful, experiential and effective change. Reflecting on the contemporary crisis of narration, characterised by precisely the substitution of narrative as a communal practice by the relentless personalised compulsion to track and post and comment or react online, Byung-Chul Han notes, quote, consumers are lonely. They do not form a community, nor can the stories shared on social media fill the narrative vacuum. They are merely forms of pornographic self-presentation or self-promotion. If the limits of this individualist, atomising ideological project were not already apparent, the COVID-19 pandemic exposed the fragility of this powerful fiction of unfettered personal autonomy and self-determination. Silicon Valley billionaires might dream of eternal life on their off-world colony on Mars, but as Beatrice Cordomà has argued, the pandemic exposed the pitfalls of the rhetoric of personalisation by revealing that health is not a private asset, nor something that can be understood outside our relationships and obligations to one another. Scholarship on health ecology has long recognised the social and structural determinants of health. I mean, this was happening in the 1920s. For instance, in a recent piece, Pronk et al. Draw upon the concept of complex and multiple interdependencies to produce an ecology of health in which social capital and power dynamics are highlighted as critical factors that span all levels, arguing that we cannot think about health and well-being outside of a recognition of the constitutive role of economic and social inequalities and their intersection with racialising, disabling, gendered and class-bound prejudice. Going even further, in a recent World Health Organization bulletin on mental health, Occhipinte et al. Notes some fundamental contradictions between good health, well-being and neoliberal ideology. And they note that, and this is a quotation that was on the slides, but I'm not sure if it's possible to show them, but I'll read it out. This is their quotation. They say, neoliberalism favours values and approaches such as individualism, self-reliance, competitiveness, self-interest, expanding material consumption and limited government intervention or collective support, where the merits of human actions are assessed only by their market value. Such ideology absolves the individual of obligations to the collective, denies the human needs of social connection, and erodes the social fabric of communities, undermining mental and, I would say, also physical health. These critical approaches offer alternative conceptions of the meanings of health and well-being that move beyond the individual and narrowly conceived notions of individual responsibility and self-realisation. And in so doing, they acknowledge both the significance of inequality, poverty, unequal social and economic and cultural capital, and the role of our relationships to each other, of communities, families, and I would add our interactions with non-living beings and our environment. Of course, this is where the challenge, the SDG 3, really reveals itself. How might we go about achieving this goal in cultures and societies that are increasingly experienced as profoundly insecure, uncertain, isolating and punitive, unsheltered, to draw upon Kingsolver's description in her novel of 2018. In other words, is it possible to achieve well-being and better health outcomes in cultures and societies whose fundamental social and economic characteristics actively contribute to the crisis in health and well-being for which individuals are expected to take personal responsibility? Moreover, if, as Amit Ghosh argues, the crises we face inevitably also present as a crisis of culture and of the imagination, how might we think about the role of narratives, narrative fiction, and imaginative cultural practices such as the novel in a world increasingly dominated by anti-human and environmentally devastating forces? Okay, so next part. Ecologies of care, ageing and dementia. From their earliest novels, both Ruth Ozeki and Barbara Kingsolver explored the knotted, messy and shifting interdependencies between individuals, communities and environments in the face of the destructive necropolitical logic and impulses of late capitalism, characterised by accumulation by dispossession, planned obsolescence, overconsumption, wastefulness and the environmental desecration that kind of follows in their wake. Kingsolver's Animal Dreams, which was published in 1990, and Ozeki's All Over Creation, which was published in 2002, tell remarkably similar stories. In both novels, an estranged daughter returns to the
Professor
community.
Burke, I'm so sorry. Would you want us to run your slides?
I did share my slides.
Yes. Should I share them? And then
That would be fantastic if you could. It will help with the some of the quotations for sure.
Yes, certainly.
Do you want to do that? Okay, so if we move to okay, yeah. So if you move to slide 7, and I'll get to slide 7 in a moment. Can you see? Okay. Can you move the slide on? Or set up the slideshow?
Arthur, it's not moving.
Ah, there we go. I think if you set it.
Yeah, now it did.
It might be quite hard to see unless it's in slideshow format. Nice. Okay, that's cool. Okay, this will help when I read some quotations. It'll make more sense of them. Okay, so I'll just sort of slightly retract my steps. So in both novels, an estranged daughter returns to the community in which they grew up to attend to the needs of an aging father with dementia in Animal Dreams, and 2 increasingly frail parents in All Over Creation. So in this novel, Yumi's father, Lloyd, who's a former potato farmer, has heart disease and is recovering from colon cancer, and her mother Momoko has dementia. We learn in both instances that the daughters became pregnant as teenagers, and this is kind of integrally bound up with the reasons why they leave home. In both texts, we see an articulation between a narrative of individual maturation and self-reflection, so the daughter's coming home, in a kind of reverse movement to the ones we typically see in, say, modernist literature, which is all about kind of fleeing the nets of the kind of places that you come from. So we see this kind of narrative of maturation, and set alongside one of increasing parental vulnerability and decline, both stories of which are embedded in a broader kind of history of industrialization, extraction of resource in Animal Dreams, rapacious profit making in terms of the potato farming, and their environmental impacts. In Animal Dreams, Cosima Homer returns home to the mining town of Grace, Arizona, and to the spectre of a sulfuric acid poisoned river, courtesy of the Black Mountain mining company. And in All Over Creation, Yumi Fuller is called home to Liberty Falls to care for her dying father and increasingly frail mother during a period at which genetically modified potatoes are coming to Idaho. In both novels, we see the juxtaposition of different formations and concepts of family and community, with both containing what might be described as a didactic or explicit element of political critique. And this is typical of both their works. In Animal Dreams, Cody's sister, Hallie, is kidnapped and killed by the US-backed Contras in the war in Nicaragua. And in All Over Creation, there's an affirmative account of the Seattle anti-capitalist protests that occurred at the turn of the millennium, calling for the reform of the World Trade Organization. Finally, in both novels, the human and environmental consequences of corporate greed and US expansionism is manifest in the physical and psychological scars that people carry, and in the denuded and damaged landscapes and devastated ecologies. Typically, I would say for Ozeki, the depiction of Yumi's father's decline and her mother's dementia and forgetfulness resonate at both a singular biographical level, as particularized elements in the story of a family, and as an allegory of the impact of agribusiness and the pesticide, insecticide and herbicide industry, and latterly the production of genetically modified crops, on a longer ecological memory and environmental heritage. Her mother Momoko, along with her father since his heart attacks have prevented him from farming, have run a business called Fuller's Seeds, offering open pollinated, rare and heirloom varieties of collected seeds to their customers. In the seed catalogue that Yumi picks up on her return home, she reads her father Lloyd's increasingly furious invective against the anti-exotic agenda of agribusiness and chemical corporations bent only on peddling their weed killers. Quote, Mrs. Fuller and I believe, firstly, and this is on the screen, that anti-exoticism is anti-life. God giveth it a body as it hath pleased him, and to every seed his own body. Corinthians 15:38. Secondly, we believe anti-exoticism to be explicitly racist. And having fought for freedom and democracy against Hitler, I do not intend to promote Third Reich eugenics in our family garden. Finally, we believe anti-exoticism to be propaganda of the very worst kind. I used to farm potatoes, and I have witnessed firsthand the demise of the American family farm. I have seen how large corporations hold the American farmer in thrall, prisoners to their chemical tyranny and their buyouts of politicians and judges. Okay. For Lloyd, then, the future of the seeds becomes a persistent worry entangled with his wife Momoko's difficulty in remembering their names and his understanding of the significance of them and of her garden for her life and well-being. In this sense, her dementia comes to signify the imposed and forced erasure of biodiversity and open pollination that accompanies the introduction of genetically modified seeds, and the wresting of agriculture from small-time farmers to big business, driven purely by an obligation to shareholders. It is tempting to read this as a form of narrative prosthesis. Sharon Snyder and David Mitchell's brilliant encapsulation of pervasive literary and cultural tendency to utilise physical, sensory, cognitive and psychological differences in an opportunistic, symbolic or metaphorical sense, and as the occasional catalyst for narration and the site of meaning making, in which impairment is a problem in need of a solution. Crucially for Mitchell and Snyder, this dependency on disability, conceived primarily as deficit or idiosyncrasy, simultaneously disavows the experiential or material realities of disabled people's lives and experiences. It simply serves a narrative function as far as they're concerned. Now, this is certainly one way of thinking about the significance of Momoko's dementia in the text, and more broadly about the harnessing of forgetfulness and confusion in the imaginative literature that has grown up around the so-called Alzheimer's epidemic over the last 40 years or so. However, I think that something more politically and ethically nuanced is happening in Ezeka's text. And this is something that characterises her work more generally in relation to the peculiar or distinctive capacity of the novel to create what Sartre described as the singular universal. Characters that are both particular and representative of the forces of history and culture that shape and circumscribe our lives. In All Over Creation, whilst Momoko's dementia allegorises the environmental assault on biodiversity and ecological memory associated with genetic modification, a violence which is further entrenched by the involvement of the teacher who years previously abused his position to make a teenage Yumi pregnant and returns in the present of the novel as a PR executive for the GM Corporation. It also gives rise to a collective obligation to remember and an ethical commitment to preserve human and non-human stories. Having come across one of Lloyd's angry missives in the Fuller Seed catalogue, an activist group called Seeds of Resistance arrives at the Fuller home, offering both practical support for Lloyd and help to save Momoko's plants from extinction, as one of the seeds, called Geek, explains to Yumi. Their storage system is a mess, he said softly. They've got thousands of different kinds of seeds in shoe boxes and envelopes and canning jars. A lot of them are unmarked. It's an archival nightmare. She's forgetting the names, he said. If no one knows what they are and if no one plants them, the seeds and their stories will die. We can see here an explicit parallel between dementia and ecological loss, alongside the assertion that all forms of life, human and non-human, are interdependent, enmeshed, and the bearers of stories for which there is crucially a collective obligation to preserve and protect. As Geek goes on, every seed has a story, encrypted in a narrative line that stretches back for thousands of years. And if you trace that story, travelling with that little seed backward in time, you might find yourself tucked into an immigrant's hatband or sewn into the hem of a young wife's dress as she smuggles you from the old country into the new world. Or you might be clinging to the belly wool of a yak as you travel across the steppes of Mongolia. Seeds tell the story of migrations and drifts. This situates human and non-human stories and their vitality in a longer, broader history of mass migration, yet it crucially displaces the human as the central character, emphasising instead the enmeshing of human and seed stories. Geek compares seeds to books, but with one big difference. He says the planet can do quite well without books. Well, we might argue about that. However, the information contained in a seed is a different story, entirely vital, pertaining to life itself. Animal Dreams also situates the ecological destruction wrought by human greed in a longer history, again drawing upon memory as a trope. People, I think this might be a quotation as well. Next slide. Oh. Okay, that's great. People can forget and forget and forget, Cody notes, but the land has a memory. The lakes and the rivers are still hanging on to the DDT and every other insult we gave them. This longer embedded ecological memory is contrasted with the short-term deliberate amnesia demanded by a rapacious and destructive corporate culture. Reflecting on the damage to the Jemez Mountains via the extraction of pumice to produce stonewashed denim, Cody contrasts the indigenous people's relationship to the land to that of American enterprise. To people who think of themselves as God's house guests, American enterprise must seem arrogant beyond belief, or stupid. A nation of amnesiacs proceeding as if there were no other day but today, assuming the land could also forget what had been done to it. So in King Solver's novel, human and ecological health and well-being are contiguous. They're inseparable. The contamination of the water water supply in some areas just a hair higher than battery acid, she notes, is an existential threat to the health and future of the community and to that of the land around them. Cody describes the poisoning of mother's milks and, quote, leaves and aborted fruits that fell in thick, brittle handfuls like the hair of a cancer patient. The land is described as dead and murdered, again foregrounding the environment as a character with a story, rather than simply a backdrop against which human stories play out. As in all over creation, the challenge to the devastation wrought by the mining company and their decision to evade environmental responsibility by damming the river comes in animal dreams from an unlikely collective. In this instance, the women of the Stitch and Bitch Club, who come together to fight the mining company and become 50 mothers for the motherless, bereaved Cody. It is the care of this collective and her rekindled relationship with her Native American lover, also named Lloyd, that ultimately reverses her flight from grief following her sister's murder and enables her to return and stay in grace, despite the pain and loss with which she associates it. It's really important that in both Kingsolver and Ozeki's work, there is an acknowledgement of the inescapability of human suffering, of the sense of loss connected to aging, dementia, impairment, and indeed death, but also an assertion of these ordinary human experiences as profoundly meaning-making, connecting us to one another, and fundamental to our collective obligations and to our interdependency. This sits alongside, and is arguably inextricably bound up with, a rejection of the acquisitiveness demanded by an economic model built upon profit and waste, and an eschewing of material possessions. For instance, in Ozeki's latest novel, there's a slide for this, The Book of Form and Emptiness, a reflection on grief, mental illness and art in a culture which provides no space or time for genuine acknowledgement of the inevitability of pain and suffering. The bereaved Annabelle O's hoarding and purchasing of craft items that she will never use, and the detritus with which she surrounds herself, serves much like Momoko's dementia in All Over Creation, to allegorize the human and environmental costs of overconsumption and the incapacity of material acquisition to meet any genuine human need or cry for solace. So this idea that we can manage the pain that we experience through consumption. If you could move the slides on, because there's quite a long quotation coming, which I think would be useful for people to see. That would be great. Next one. That's great, thank you. We also see something similar at play in Barbara Kingsolver's later novel, Unsheltered, in which we're presented with a historical dialogue between the 19th and 21st centuries, juxtaposing the Make America Great Again supporting climate denial of today with the anti-Darwinian populism of the past. The novel offers a sustained critical reflection on an unsheltered world and the conjunction of economic collapse, acute precarity and social injustice in the context of the climate emergency and the crisis in access to medical and social care for all but the ultra-wealthy in the USA. In Unsheltered, Tig, the adult daughter of a family who find themselves in straitened financial and personal circumstances, notes that the free market has the morality of a cancer cell, noting that her brother's new baby has been born in the historical moment of no more free lunch, in which, quote, friends will probably count more than money because wanting too much stuff is going to be toxic. We didn't ask for this, it's just what we've got. The fear of being unsheltered that frames the narrative is therefore slowly unpicked and reimagined in both the dialogized past and present narratives. Thatcher, the embattled figure fighting for the recognition of Darwinism in late 19th century small-town America, Vineland, finally realizes He was finished with declaring himself to a public without ears to hear his language. Without shelter, we stand in daylight, she'd insisted once, and he had thought only of death. Simple man. He might sleep in a bed of cactus thorns or a tree under the stars, but he could choose the company he kept, and it would not be this fearful, self-interested mob shut in airless rooms. They would huddle in the artifice of safety, and their heaven would collapse. This echoes, and this is the next slide, I think, I hope. This echoes Tig's earlier comments to her mother, Willa. Poor Mama, she said, leaning her springy head against Willa's shoulder. I know. It feels like the end of the world when you can't have the things you always wanted. But it's not the end of the world. There's some other place to go. And Willa says, without a roof over your head, it kind of feels like you might die. And Tig replies, yeah, but you might not. For sure you won't find your way out of the mess if you keep picking up bricks and stuffing them in your pockets. What you have to do is look for blue sky. Hope, therefore, resides in a radical reimagining of what and who matters. So to conclude, what we see emerge in these novels is an understanding of health and well-being that depends upon collective, communal and communitarian impulses and actions. This is connected to the formation of new utopian collectives, of non-normative familial groupings and unlikely marginalised people, and of empathy that extends beyond biological ties and reaches out to encompass human and non-human life. And in the Book of Form and Emptiness, includes even the inanimate objects whose voices Benny O, who's Annabelle's son in this story, can hear. Care for people, places and the natural world are centred and presented as vital practices in every sense of the word vital, rather than burdensome problems to be managed or avoided. And places of value beyond the logic of capitalist accumulation or ownership. Both of the earlier novels I've discussed, Animal Dreams and All Over Creation, feature key figures whose difficulties appear to stem from a kind of misalignment of self and place, as if self-realization is perpetually displaced or dislocated and always elsewhere in temporal and spatial terms. What Matthew Seller terms a kind of place pathology. Thus both Cody and Yumi initially feel like strangers or interlopers in the places from which they come. I mean, I suppose this is a recurrent sort of figure or trope in a lot of literature. Again, this form of subjective misalignment is addressed to an engagement with these new collectivities that go beyond biological family ties. For instance, the coming of the seeds of resistance in All Over Creation and the Stitch and Bitch Club in Animal Dreams. And it's interesting that this kind of focus on alternative figurations of family, social justice and futurity is something that arguably characterises the broader contemporary political unconscious, which is manifest in popular cultural texts and films like Snowpiercer and the most recent series of New Detective, for instance, and which has been explored from a theoretical perspective in books such as Sophie Lewis's Abolish the Family, a manifesto for care and liberation. So there's this kind of interest in sort of novel communities comprising the unlikely coming together of disparate figures. And I've started to think about this using David Graeber's work on sort of pirates as kind of pirate communities. In other words, people thinking about the history of pirates as kind of disparate, anti-authoritarian but cohesive groupings. And I think we see that there's a lot in sort of recent literature. Anyway, in both of the novels that I've discussed, we also see the formation of these new communities linked to the disruption of normative, deficit-led and highly medicalised models of impairment, dementia, disability and ageing. So, finally, to return to the provocative insights of health ecology and to the question of whether health and well-being are possible under conditions of environmental and human exploitation, in all of these texts, and in fact across the work of Kingsolver and Ozeki, conditions of habitability, in other words, being in the world in a livable mode, are not achievable in an environment in which the production of surplus value is posited as the primary objective, and in which individual self-realization and autonomy are privileged over collective and reciprocal obligations to one another. Indeed, the very structures, practices and concepts of value to which they give rise, to which this kind of ideology of individualism and individual responsibility for health and well-being and aging well, for instance, are presented by both Kingsolver and Ozeki as at odds with human flourishing, a concept that their text suggests needs to embrace the wild and unruly diversity of human minds and bodies across the life course, alongside an acknowledgement of our obligations to each other and to non-human life, including our conjoined destinies. Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Professor Burke. We now open this to questions and comments from the audience. Roy has a question. Roy, please go ahead.
Thank you, Atul. I put it in the chat to avoid echo.
The chat, it's in the chat. Oh, that's a really interesting question. Thank you. I'm not sure how best to answer it. That's so interesting. I think, of course, forgetting in some contexts can seem to be a positive phenomenon, and actually is also probably integral to our survival as well, and to our well-being. But yes, I think her work, and I think Kingsolver's work has become kind of more and more sort of politically conscious and explicit in its engagement with the sort of climate crisis, although I think this runs all the way through everything that she's done. And I've recently listened to a piece of work she did as a journalist about copper mining in Arizona, and I think she's sort of super interesting in that respect. And I think Ozeki has become more formally experimental in ways which kind of reflect her interest in human and non-human things. But yes, and I don't know about the newer collectives they might find themselves in there. Perhaps you could say more, Roy, about that.
I do not know enough to elaborate, Professor Burke, but thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions, comments, responses to Professor Burke's talk? Madhavi Ravi Kumar has a question. Please go ahead. Please go ahead, Mr. Kumar.
Yeah, sorry. I have to unmute it. Yes. Yeah, yeah. Um, Thank you, Professor Burke, for such a deeply reflective and intellectually rich presentation. So your analysis of Working Slower and Ujuki offers a compelling intervention into how we might rethink health, aging, and well-being in ecologically fraught times. As someone working at the intersection of media, environment, and cultural studies, I find your use of literature to reframe these debates, particularly thought-provoking, actually. So I have two brief questions. You mentioned that both health and well-being are what Raymond Williams termed keywords, active size of meaning making. So in the novels you have studied, how do Kingslover and Ujuki challenge biomedical or individualistic notions of well-being? Do you see them reframing health as something more collective or even planetary in scale? And my second question is, building on your point about vulnerability and care, I was especially struck by your framing of well-being as a communal responsibility. If possible, could you elaborate on how the texts imagine alternative ethics of care, particularly, when we talk about in relation to non-human life or environmental interconnectedness? Do they move beyond the human to imagine more than human care relationships?
Thank you. Those are two big questions. I might come back to you, but okay. In terms of health, I'm going to actually talk about Ruth Ozeki's most recent novel, The Book of Form and Emptiness, because I think it kind of crystallizes some of the things that you see developing through earlier novels. And in this novel, The Book of Form and Emptiness, it's oriented around and begins with the death of Annabelle's husband and Benny's father, and he's killed because he's gone out. He's a jazz musician. He's gone out. He's come back. He's been intoxicated. He falls asleep. His body is covered by crows who protect him, but then he's not seen, and a van comes and drives over him and kills him. And the consequences of that catastrophe is this kind of absolute kind of explosion of a kind of inarticulate grief on the part of Annabelle, who is very isolated. And Benny, her son, starts to experience auditory hallucinations. And he is eventually put under section and sent to a kind of mental health facility, a psychiatric ward. Now, the novel is, and in that process, he actually meets a bunch of people who are also deemed to be mentally unwell. Now, the novel is really interesting in that it questions the kind of biomedical model that views diagnosis as the most significant thing or the end point for somebody. In other words, as if finding a diagnosis is the key that unlocks the difficulties that people are experiencing. And instead it offers very different ways of thinking about what Benny's auditory hallucinations, the voices he hears, might be about. And it ties them to his creativity and to his capacity to tell stories. And in that he's kind of and he ends up being helped and supported by a group of people who are also marginalized and dispossessed. So a homeless man, an older but still young woman who has experienced self-harm and substance abuse, a very high achieving person, young man who can't kind of meet the expectations of his family. So it offers community, and it offers support and a social group as a source of a very significant formative source of psychological support, rather than fixating on a medicalized model of deficit that goes hand in hand with sort of medicalization and medication. And I think that kind of resistance to sort of over medicalization is something that you can also see in the descriptions of dementia. So, you know, the interesting thing about Ozeki and Kingsolver's account of dementia in these early novels is that they don't do what a lot of the literature that has grown up around dementia does, which is to talk about what a diagnosis is and what it means and what's happening to somebody's brain. They locate the difficulties that the people are experiencing in the kind of context of older life and family life and day-to-day living, but they're not fixated on diagnosis. And I think that is quite interesting and quite important, and sort of counterpoint to a sort of scramble for diagnosis, as if diagnosis unlocks significant things about human beings, when in fact diagnosis, you know, is undoubtedly helpful, but isn't necessarily the beginning and end of the story, and certainly not necessarily what people need to be able to live well with an impairment. So I think that's my response to your first question.
Thank
And the second one was about well-being and sort of collectives, wasn't it? I think. Am I right?
Yes.
Yeah. Again, I you know, and I think these things are tied up with one another. I think both texts tell a story in which there is a kind of communal and collective responsibility for the care of others. And this carries on through sort of both of their works, but people taking on the work of care, you know, who might not necessarily, you know, have any biological ties to the family, but who do it for, because kind of care in itself is kind of part of an obligation to living well in the world. You know, so in All Over Creation, these young people who are part of the Seeds of Resistance, one of them comes along and is prepared to help Yumi's father with his stoma, changing his, you know, he's had colon cancer, he needs a lot of help, his personal care. He comes along and does this because he can, and it's not presented as some kind of terror, you know, some kind of act of great sort of sacrifice. It's presented as something that humans do for one another, you know, when people move in and out of relationships of dependency and need through the life course. And you have in a number of the texts people with non-biological relationships to children and to babies taking on the act of care for those children. So a kind of reimagining of what families might be and what that might look like, and that is bound up with and intimately connected to the things that the novels are trying to say about care for the environment, care for the spaces in which we live, the act of caring as a meaningful activity in and of itself, something that is life enhancing as well as protective and sort of life protective in an environmental sense.
Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. They were big ones.
If there are no more questions, we could move on to a formal vote of thanks by Professor Ahmed Kurian, who is the Faculty Fellow of the UNESCO Chair here at the University of Hyderabad.
I'll keep this really brief because the echo is pretty bad. And I think it's bad for all of us from the university. Oh, it cleared up. Did it not, Professor Burke? Well, and suddenly hasn't it cleared up, Pramod?
I don't know. Yes, it
Yes.
has.
Yes, it has.
Just in time for us to conclude. We have, on behalf of the department and on behalf of the UNESCO Chair, Vulnerability Studies, I would like to apologize first and foremost for the terrible echo and the terrible connectivity. We are having a storm here, so the electricity keeps coming and going. We lose connection all the time. It's pretty deplorable. But thank you so much, Professor Burke, in spite of the fact that we forgot to put on your slides. You kept going, soldiering on. It was a valiant effort. I'm sorry, but we were really not prepared for this kind of a setup today. And thank you for a very good talk where I think several of us would have learned a lot. And it will definitely help our listeners in thinking through these questions. So thank you once again for joining us from France today. And thank you to all the others as well who turned up for this talk. Thank you once again and have a great weekend, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Burke.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, especially for all the great work.
Oh, thank you. No, it's been a real pleasure, and I'm sorry about your storm. If I could control the weather, I would. So that's great. Thank you.